She smirked as the tow truck rolled in, because she told dispatch my truck was stolen. What she didn't know. The license plate led straight to a state trooper commander. It was an ordinary afternoon. The kind where nothing unusual ever happens. I pulled my truck into the same spot I'd used dozens of times before. A clearly marked public parking area with no restrictions, no signage, and no reason for concern. I shut off the engine, stepped out, and locked the door without a second thought. To me, it was just another routine stop in the middle of a busy day. But the moment my boots touched the pavement, I felt that uncomfortable sensation of being watched. Across the street, a woman stood frozen near her driveway, arms crossed tight against her chest, eyes fixed on me like I'd just committed some kind of offense. At first, I brushed it off. People stare for all sorts of reasons, and I wasn't interested in starting an unnecessary confrontation. I adjusted my jacket, checked my phone, and started walking away. But even then, I could feel her gaze following me, sharp and judgmental, like she was already building a story in her head about who I was and why I didn't belong there. I stopped for a moment and looked back, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. She didn't look away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, lips pressed together in a thin line of disapproval. There was something familiar about that expression, the kind that comes from someone who believes rules exist for everyone else, but authority belongs to them. I'd seen it many times before, usually right before a situation went sideways. Still, I chose to ignore it. I reminded myself that the truck was parked legally, that I wasn't blocking a driveway or violating any ordinance, and that I had no obligation to explain myself to a stranger. I turned back and continued on, telling myself that whatever problem she thought she saw would fade once she realized there wasn't one. That assumption turned out to be very wrong. As I walked, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. She had already pulled out her phone. Not to take a picture, not to text. She held it the way someone does when they're remaking a call they feel justified about. Her posture straightened, and there was a sense of purpose in the way she spoke. Even from a distance, I couldn't hear her words, but I didn't need to. I knew that tone. It was the sound of someone reporting something, confident that the system would back them up. For a brief moment, I considered walking back over and asking if there was a problem. But experience has taught me that people who act this way aren't looking for a conversation. They were looking for control. Engaging would only give her the confrontation she seemed to want. So I kept going, unaware of just how far she was about to take it. Behind me, that ordinary parking spot had already transformed into something else in her mind, a crime scene, a violation, a problem that needed to be handled. And with one phone call, she decided to turn a perfectly normal afternoon into a situation that would soon involve dispatchers, records, and consequences she never saw coming. I didn't find out about the call right away. In fact, for several minutes, everything continued as normal, at least on the surface. I went about my business, completely unaware that, behind me, a false report was already moving through the system. To her, it wasn't enough that she didn't like my truck being there. She wanted it gone. And in her mind, that meant using the fastest, most aggressive option available. Instead of reporting a parking issue, she told the dispatcher the vehicle was stolen. That single lie changed everything. A stolen vehicle report isn't treated casually. It triggers procedures, verification steps, and immediate action. While I was still walking, the dispatcher began running the license plate, logging the location, and relaying details to the towing service and patrol units. Karen stood there, phone still pressed to her ear, nodding along as if she were doing the community a favor. Every few seconds, she glanced toward my truck, a satisfied look crossing her face, like she'd already won. Within a short time, a tow truck was dispatched. The driver rolled into the area with purpose, scanning for the vehicle that matched the description he'd been given. From her perspective, everything was unfolding exactly as planned. She positioned herself where she could see it all. Arms folded again, chin slightly raised. This wasn't about safety anymore. This was about power, about proving she could make something happen just because she wanted it to. What she didn't understand was that false reports leave a trail. Every call is recorded. Every claim is logged. And when you escalate a situation by lying, you invite scrutiny you can control. The dispatcher followed protocol, double-checking the information before authorizing the tow. The system doesn't just act blindly, no matter how confident a caller sounds. As the tow truck prepared to hook up my vehicle, the dispatcher asked routine questions, verifying ownership and status. That's when the timeline slowed. The plate check didn't come back the way she expected. Instead of confirming a stolen vehicle, the database flagged something unusual. The truck wasn't just registered. It was tied to a state-issued record, updated regularly, and clearly not reported stolen by its owner. The dispatcher paused, rechecked the information, and then ran it again. Karen couldn't hear that part. Of course, all she saw was the tow truck waiting instead of moving. Her confident stance began to shift into irritation. She started gesturing, pointing at the truck, as if urging them to hurry up. From her point of view, they were dragging their feet on something that should have been simple. But it wasn't simple anymore. What she thought would be a quick removal had turned into a verification process she couldn't interrupt. The dispatcher continued digging, comparing the caller's claim against official records. And with each second that passed, the gap between her story and the truth widened. That tow truck never lifted my vehicle. Instead, it sat idle, caught in the space between a lie and a system designed to expose it. Karen had made her move, convinced she was in control. She had no idea that the very call she placed to get rid of my truck was about to bring far more attention than she ever wanted, and that the next question from dispatch would flip the entire situation upside down. The moment that changed everything didn't come with sirens or flashing lights. It came quietly, buried in a routine process that Karen never thought twice about. While she stood there waiting for the tow truck to do its job, the dispatcher kept following procedure, running the plate through multiple systems, cross-checking registration details, and verifying the report against state records. What popped up on the screen wasn't just a mismatch, it was a red flag. The truck wasn't listed as stolen. In fact, it wasn't flagged for anything at all. Instead, the registration tied back to a state-issued vehicle record, one that required additional verification before any action could be taken. That alone was enough to stop the tow process cold. The dispatcher leaned back, reread the information, and then did what experienced dispatchers do when something doesn't add up. They asked another question. This time, the tone of the call changed. Gone was the routine checklist voice. In its place was a careful, deliberate calm. The dispatcher contacted me directly using the information linked to the vehicle. When my phone rang, I answered without urgency, still unaware of the full situation unfolding behind the scenes. "Sir," the dispatcher said, "can you confirm your identity and current assignment?" That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. Dispatchers don't ask that unless they've already seen something significant. I calmly confirmed my name. There was a brief pause, the sound of keys tapping, and then a second, more direct question followed. "Are you currently serving as a state trooper commander?" I didn't raise my voice or show surprise. I simply answered yes. On the other end of the line, everything shifted. I could hear it in the dispatcher's breathing, the way their posture changed even through the phone. Procedures tightened. Notes were updated. What had started as a simple stolen vehicle claim was now clearly a false report involving a law enforcement officer. That's not something any dispatcher takes lightly. Immediately, the tow authorization was suspended. The dispatcher notified the towing company to stand down and instructed them not to touch the vehicle. At the same time, internal alerts were sent to supervisors, documenting the false report and identifying the caller who made it. Every word Karen had said was now being replayed, reviewed, and compared against verified facts. What struck me most in that moment wasn't satisfaction or anger. It was how smoothly the system corrected itself once the truth surfaced. No shouting, no confrontation, just clear steps, executed properly, exactly as designed. Authority didn't need to be announced, it was already there. Embedded in the process, the dispatcher apologized for the inconvenience, though none was necessary. I assured them there was no issue on my end and thanked them for handling it professionally. When the call ended, the situation was no longer about a truck or a parking spot. It had escalated into something far more serious for the person who made the false report. Karen, still standing near her driveway, had no idea that the game she thought she was playing had just ended. She believed she was moments away from watching my truck get hauled off. In reality, the system had already seen through the lie, identified who I was, and shifted its focus from my vehicle to her actions. Karen sensed that something was wrong before anyone said a word to her. The tow truck wasn't moving. The driver hadn't even stepped out with his equipment. And the confident flow she expected had stalled completely. At first, she reacted with irritation. She waved her hand sharply toward my truck, pointed at it again, and spoke to the driver in quick, clipped motions, clearly trying to push him into action. But the driver just shook his head and stayed put, phone still in his hand, waiting on instructions he hadn't been given yet. That's when the tension on her face began to shift. The smug expression faded, replaced by confusion, then unease. She checked her phone, glanced at the tow truck, and looked around as if trying to find out who was in charge now. The control she thought she had was slipping, and she could feel it. When she stepped closer to the driver and raised her voice, he finally responded, but not in the way she expected. He told her calmly that there was a hold on the tow and that dispatch had instructed him not to touch the vehicle. Her reaction was immediate. "What do you mean?" "A hold," she snapped, her voice suddenly louder than before. She tried to reassert herself, repeating that the truck was stolen, that she'd already reported it, that everything had been confirmed. But the more she talked, the more desperate she sounded. Confidence doesn't crack all at once, it fractures, piece by piece. Moments later, a patrol vehicle rolled into view. No sirens, no rush, just presence. That alone was enough to change the energy in the air. Karen straightened up instinctively, smoothing her hair and adjusting her posture, as if presentation could fix what was happening. When the officer stepped out and began speaking with the tow driver instead of her, she realized she was no longer the center of attention. She tried to insert herself into the conversation, offering explanations that hadn't been asked for. "I was just being cautious," she said. "It looked suspicious." The words tumbled out faster now, layered with justification and denial. But the officer didn't react to the emotion. He listened, nodded once, and then asked a simple question about the report she'd made. As her answers were compared against recorded information, the reality of her situation became impossible to ignore. False reporting isn't a misunderstanding, it's a decision. And the system had already documented hers. The officer's tone remained calm, professional, and firm, which somehow made the consequences feel heavier. There was no argument to push back against, no authority to challenge. Karen's voice softened. She backtracked. She tried to reframe the call as a mistake. But by then, it was too late. The lie had been logged, the call recorded, and the discrepancy clear. The power dynamic she'd relied on had fully reversed, and she knew it. Her eyes darted from the officer to the tow truck and back again, searching for an exit that didn't exist. Standing there, watching her realization unfold, I felt no need to intervene or speak up. The moment wasn't about proving who I was. It was about accountability. She had set the situation in motion, convinced she could control the outcome. Instead, she found herself facing the consequences of abusing a system designed to protect, not to serve personal grudges. By the time everything was laid out clearly, the situation had settled into a quiet that felt heavier than any confrontation ever could. The tow truck driver was dismissed, thanked for following protocol, and instructed to clear the area. My truck remained exactly where I'd parked it, untouched, just as it should have been from the start. What changed wasn't the scene, it was the understanding of what had just happened and who was now accountable for it. The officer explained the next steps in a steady, professional tone. The false report was officially documented, including the recorded call, the timestamp, and the actions it triggered. Karen listened, arms no longer crossed, shoulders slightly slumped, nodding along as if compliance might soften the outcome. She wasn't being yelled at or threatened, and that seemed to unsettle her even more. There was no drama left to hide behind, only facts. She attempted one last explanation. Something about being concerned for the neighborhood, about not knowing the rules, about acting in good faith. But good faith doesn't involve reporting a vehicle as stolen when it isn't. The officer acknowledged her words without validating them, making it clear that intent and impact are two very different things. Emergency systems rely on honesty, and when that trust is broken, it carries consequences. I was asked if I wanted to add anything to the report. I declined, not because I couldn't, but because there was nothing more to say. The record already spoke for itself. Sometimes the most effective response isn't adding pressure, it's allowing the process to run its course without interference. Authority, when used correctly, doesn't seek attention. It ensures fairness. Karen was informed that misuse of emergency services could lead to further action if repeated. The warning wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was a line drawn clearly and formally. She would remember it. The way she avoided eye contact said as much. Her earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that her actions had followed her farther than she intended. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them offered a brief apology for the inconvenience. I thanked them and returned to my truck, unlocking the door with the same calm I had when I first parked. The entire incident, from start to finish, had unfolded without raised voices or unnecessary force. The system had corrected itself, just as it's designed to do when people do their jobs properly. Driving away, I reflected on how easily situations like this escalate when ego gets involved. One phone call, fueled by entitlement, had nearly caused a cascade of unnecessary actions, but it also served as a reminder that accountability still matters. Not everyone who abuses authority wears a badge. Some simply believe they have power they don't. That day ended the way it should have, quietly, legally, and without spectacle. Karen didn't get the outcome she wanted, but she got something more important, a clear lesson in boundaries and consequences. In my truck, it never moved an inch. If you enjoy real stories where truth exposes entitlement and accountability wins, subscribe to the channel. These stories happen more often than you think.